Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're joined on Zoom by Tam Hunt, public policy lawyer and green energy law and policy writer. Tam has taught at the graduate level at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Brin School of Environmental Science and Management, and at the University of Hawaii, Manoa's Richardson School of Law. He's also a part-time academic at UC Santa Barbara's Meta Lab, where he studies consciousness and psychology. Hi, Tam.
Hi, how are you?
Glad to have you with us today. Let's just jump right into it. What is the case for climate optimism?
Yeah, so I've been in the climate and green energy field now for over 20 years. I've been a lawyer for 23 years. And in the last 10 years, I have been a bit of a contrarian in that my work has attempted to paint a bit less dire picture about the progress on mitigation measures in particular. So I wrote a book in 2015 called Solar, Why Our Energy Future is So Bright. And I'm happy to say in the 10 years since, I've been proven correct on a lot of big issues that I talk about in the book, and in particular on the trends for installing renewables like solar, in particular, battery storage, electric vehicles, wind power. So I want to caveat, I'm not saying we're out of the woods. I'm not saying, stop worrying, all is good. Let me kind of clarify what I do mean by the case for climate optimism. What I'm suggesting, and have been now for, like I said, 10 years, is that we are actually on some very positive pathways for installing renewables around the world and shifting away from fossil fuels for transportation also. And we are now looking at a pretty good pathway for becoming almost 100% renewable for electricity, probably in the US and globally by 2035 to 2040. Quite a bit faster than people thought was possible a long time ago, or even recently, frankly, because things have changed so dramatically. I'll talk a bit later about the electric vehicle piece because that's a bit more complicated. But the kind of the short answer, and we can dive into more details as we proceed here, is that we have seen a very virtuous cycle of installations breeding lower costs for solar and battery storage in particular, then breeding more installations, then breeding lower costs. And so there's a very predictable curve called Swanson's law with solar power, where you get roughly a 20% drop in price for every doubling of global installations of solar. So that's what I call the virtuous cycle. And it's quite predictable. You can look at the record over the last 50 years, and it's been, quite a good straight line with some bumps along the way, but generally a straight line. So I used that kind of data in my book 10 years ago to say, well, look, if this continues, where do we get by 2025, 2030, 2035, et cetera? And I've been, to toot my own horn a bit, I've been very accurate in my forecast. And of course, I didn't know for sure is my best guess, but using the tools I had available, it turns out I've been quite accurate. And we're seeing, very predictable cost declines that will lead to increased installations of solar, battery storage, wind power, et cetera. And we're seeing that more and more in the electric vehicle space also, but that's, like I said, a bit more complicated. So I'll stop for now on that.
So you're just seeing the advances in the technology and the drop in price, mass production, whatever is driving the renewable industry.
Exactly.
How does that play into the politics? I mean, climate deniers and such. I mean, the optimism is good, so we certainly see that curve. Do you think there are challenges, either politically or from the fossil fuel industry, that could disrupt that curve?
There are certainly challenges and there's certainly pushbacks. But we have seen that curve, like I said, be quite reliable in terms of both, cost declines and installation increases. We're now seeing solar in many countries becoming the default power option for new power supplies. And the transition is happening, very, very quickly in relative terms compared to past energy transitions at this scale. In terms of pushback from, the big fossil fuel, big oil, there is pushback. And we have seen some retrenchment in terms of, for example, BP at one time branded itself as Beyond Petroleum, maybe 15 years ago, and it has since kind of pulled back from that rebranding a bit. And we are seeing, without getting too much into this rabbit hole, we are seeing a lot of money and attention being paid to hydrogen as a kind of bridge fuel. And I don't support this in general because the process of creating green hydrogen through electrolysis of water is extremely inefficient. And if you're using green electricity, which is how you would do it typically, you would get 3 times more usable energy by simply using that electricity directly in batteries. So it's extremely lossy. You know, why would you go, for example, 100 miles in an EV, sorry, in a fuel cell car versus 300 miles in a battery electric car on the same power if you can choose to just simply use that power directly in a battery electric car. And that really is the difference. It's a 3x difference. It's huge. So in terms of pushback, we're seeing a lot of focus by big oil on that sector because they see their bread buttered as a transition to a renewable future by using fossil fuels like natural gas to create hydrogen. And this is how most hydrogen is created today. It's called natural gas reformation. And this is a way to create hydrogen. You certainly can do it. It is done widely, but it's not green. It's not efficient. It's not beneficial to the public or for climate mitigation. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of ferment and conflict going on both behind the scenes and sometimes publicly. But the general trends I outlined in terms of the renewable transition are very real, and you're seeing more and more countries going toward renewables in a big way, and it's actually accelerating in most parts of the world, not decelerating.
So there is a good cause for optimism there. You're a public policy attorney, but you seem to specialize in green energy law. Can you give us a little bit of your background there?
Yeah, so my area of public policy has been through my career primarily green energy public policy. And so, I've taught climate change law and policy, like you mentioned in the intro, at UC Santa Barbara, at UH Manoa, Richardson School of Law. I've taught renewable energy law and policy, and I've worked for different clients over the years on those same issues. And my particular niche is primarily in what I call regulatory policy. And so I have nonprofit clients, I have some for-profit clients, but I work primarily at the California Public Utilities Commission, representing those clients on regulatory matters pertaining to solar, electric vehicles, battery storage, climate change policy, et cetera. And so I also do some work for private clients developing solar power projects, and it involves getting site control, getting permits to build, getting interconnection authority, selling the power, for example. So I'm pretty unusual in that, my whole career has been for the last, was it now, 18 years, been focused on green energy law and policy.
So is the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, is that a good example of green energy policy?
Definitely, yeah. So even though that bill is called the IRA, its main impact was to actually provide a new set of tax credits for various kinds of green energy. And so I forget the number, but it was, I think, around maybe $400 billion in tax credits for green energy, which is, historically a massive sum. And a lot of that is going toward EVs. And there was some controversy. The EV tax credits were actually going to expire, and then they were re-upped. And, for your listeners, they may know this, but if they don't, I'll kind of describe quickly how it works. You can now receive up to $7,500 in a point of sale rebate, which is officially a tax credit, but the rules changed now where you actually can simply get that as a rebate as a deduction on the cost of the car or truck you're buying if it's a qualifying vehicle. And it has to have batteries made in the US, has to be fully electric, has to be under a certain cost, I think 80 grand or so. So it's a huge benefit, and it is expensive to to taxpayers in foregone tax collections. But my view is that it's worth it because this is a really important public policy, and it's doing a lot to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels in transportation. Also, for your listeners' edification, there is a used EV tax credit that works similarly. And so if you buy a used EV at $25,000 or below, you can get $4,000 off of the cost of that vehicle, as again, a point of sale rebate in effect, even though it is officially a tax credit. So those are major benefits from IRA. And there's a lot of other ones in there too for green energy, also for nuclear, which I'm not a supporter of. And I think also quite a bit for hydrogen, which, as we talked about, I'm also not a big fan of. But I think we'll look back maybe from 10 to 20 years in the future and say the Infrastructure Act was a major step toward getting off fossil fuels.
And I know there's those rebates and stuff for individuals, and there are also policies or programs in there for states, charging stations, things like that. How are those going? Are those being implemented evenly across the states?
Well, the charger program was primarily funded by the precursor to IRA. And I forget the name. I think it's like the Infrastructure Act or something like that. And that has rolled out pretty slowly under the Biden administration. I think it's starting to have an impact this year. So it's passed a couple of years ago. And the hope is that it is, fully deployed and all that funding allocated before anything happens in the White House in terms of new people coming in. If, Trump does win, hopefully he doesn't, but he certainly could. He's, announced his intention to change green energy policy pretty dramatically. So we'll see. But there definitely has been a lot of incentives coming down from the Biden administration to promote this transition. I do want to stress, though, that these long-term trends I'm talking about, and I wrote about in 2015 in my book, these are primarily market-based trends. And it certainly helps to have some supportive tax credits and similar measures as carrots. But a lot of these forces actually operate independently of those kind of things, or they're not separated. But the primary trend is based on market dynamics, based on what's called learning curves. And it really is an impact and an effect of market participants competing and learning, because of their need to compete, how to produce things more cheaply and efficiently over time, and just iterating. Tax credits help, but they're not the primary force here.
Like the tax credits are like startup funds. It's a way to get something rolling in a given direction, but then, like you say, market takes over after that.
Yeah, ideally, I think good public policy and good tax policy is designed to do exactly that. It's designed to kind of help a given good, in this case, getting off fossil fuels, get over certain humps that, may be present. But, if Trump does come in and takes away the tax credit for electric vehicles, we might see a temporary dip, but I think the long-term trend will hold very, very true.
That's good to know. What other type of green energy policies do you think we need?
On the electricity side, for renewables, one battle I've been fighting my whole career is to shift the focus away from really large utility scale projects that can be on the solar side as big as, say, 6 square miles in the desert. There was actually the Topaz Solar Project was built about a decade ago in San Luis Obispo County in Central California, not too far from where I used to live. I was based in Santa Barbara for 15 years. And, I never opposed that project, but I wasn't particularly supportive because, to me, that's big. That's a lot of land being taken out of habitat. And even though it's a fairly desolate area, it still is habitat for certain animals. And when you have the alternative of what I call community scale renewables that can do the job in most cases, say, 20 megawatts or so rather than 500 like Topaz is. If you build, 1 to 20 megawatt size projects closer to load, smaller projects, even, build out every warehouse in California before you go to these really large desert-based projects, you can probably do the job. So, for example, I flew into LA recently, and I'm astounded that still 20 years after I began my career in this space, you fly into LA and you see these seas of massive white roofs, and almost none of them have solar. And I know exactly why this is the case. It's because California policy has not supported developing those warehouse roofs, because you cannot build those facilities out and then sell power back to the grid. You can do net metering, and you can do on-site, you can serve on-site load, but big warehouses don't have typically anywhere near the on-site load to support fully building out those roofs. If you had favorable policies like a feed-in tariff, which gives a transparent and clear price signal over a certain contractual time, that you can build out those facilities and sell power to the grid for say 20 years, that would quickly incentivize a lot of those warehouse roofs going solar, and with accompanying battery storage on site to make them firm power. So that is one example of this ongoing battle between utilities, regulators like the PUC, and ratepayer advocates, who all see these really big projects as being better for ratepayers and consumers, because they argue incorrectly that those big projects are cheaper, but they're not taking into account the transmission cost or the environmental cost of building those really big projects. When you factor in all those costs, the community scale projects are in fact cheaper, better for the environment, and closer to load. So it's like in a lot of fields where you have big money coming in, big money can corrupt and pervert outcomes. And so even though I am optimistic about the general trend, because even though Topaz, for example, is much bigger than I'd like, it still is green power. It's still better than the fossil fuel alternatives. But we're trying very hard, myself and my co-thinkers, to shift the conversation toward community scale renewables, microgrids, warehouse roofs, parking lots, et cetera, really build out that infrastructure with all the solar and battery storage that can fit before we go for yet more transmission lines, yet more massive desert-based projects.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that difference between community solar and the big public projects, but that makes a lot of sense. What about international green energy policies? I mean, how are we doing with what's out there, what's needed?
Yeah, so I'm not expert in international green energy policy, but I do follow it. I don't work in it personally, but I'll give some high-level comments. I have followed the UN negotiations for over 30 years. I recall a class I took as an undergrad at UC San Diego, where we debated, the latest IPCC reports on climate change and what to do about it. And even though there's a lot of press attention paid to, for example, the Paris Treaty, that was, voluntary, non-binding, and there's a lot of incentives to claim victory in these negotiations and saying, hey, we got an agreement. My view is, again, a bit, out of the mainstream here. I see the UN process as almost completely ineffective, and it has been for 30 years. There's been, massive numbers of meetings, massive, amounts of media attention paid to it. But when you look at what's actually driving these markets and the transition away from fossil fuels, I think the UN process has done almost nothing. And I'm a fan of the UN in general. I certainly do appreciate international law and policy. I'm a big fan of, a more peaceful world, and a stronger overlay of international law. I think in this context that I've followed pretty closely, if you actually look at what's been achieved in terms of impacts on the ground because of the UN process, I'd say it's been about zero.
Is there, what do we do about that? I mean, how do we implement international policies that are binding and or effective in your mind?
It's a very tricky problem. I don't have an easy solution. I'll just, share some reflections. I think in this case, and in almost anything to do with economics, no nation ever in history has agreed to limit its own growth. So the imperative of the modern world and economic paradigm is growth, right? rightly or wrongly, that's the imperative. The asterisk there is that certainly there has been a lot of discussion and I think some traction in the idea that we need to shift to development as a paradigm rather than growth. So it shouldn't be about GDP growth. It should be about how to create a more sustainable economy that works for the environment, that works for labor, that works for the whole society. Um, so there's, a little wiggle room in that imperative for growth. And I think the UN process has shown very clearly that nations are not going to voluntarily bind themselves to agreements that they perceive as limiting their growth. What you can do, what has happened, is that as technology has changed and as prices have come down, as I've talked about, then the markets respond in a way that allows for the transition and reduction in emissions through market forces. And so this again is where tax policy comes in, where good policy more generally comes in, is to shift the economic calculations that are being made by every company involved in the market, to shift the calculations that are being made by governments issuing RFPs for new facilities, or utilities, issuing RFPs for new facilities, to allow for market forces to come to the fore in a way that can be beneficial. And this is an ongoing conversation, and it's very complicated. But we are seeing market forces, as I mentioned earlier, I think, becoming the primary driver of the transition. And so the role of policy and good leadership is to basically change the design of those markets to promote better outcomes.
So you see market being as effective in other countries as it is in the US.
Yeah, I mean, rightly or wrongly, the capitalism and market-based economies of the world are transitioning away from fossil fuels, and there's obviously a very big conversation there about are we doing it fast enough? Is capitalism ruining the planet more generally, even as we transition away from fossil fuels? That's a bigger conversation, but we are seeing in this case a beneficial harnessing of market forces to get us off fossil fuels faster than
About,
most people.
yeah, what about the global South? Countries that have smaller economies and such, is market as effective there? Are there other policies that need to be implemented to help those countries transition to green energy?
Well, I couldn't give you, a complete survey of global South nations and their progress on renewables, but many are transitioning away quite rapidly, based generally on market forces, because most countries in the world nowadays are market-based societies. Um, so yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, let's move on to renewable energy transition. Talk about the transition. Well, we've been seriously transitioning for about 20 years now. How do you think the transition is going?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. I just wrote a piece for Civil Beat, which is the main news publication here in Hawaii for online news. They're a nonprofit, and as their name suggests, they focus on civil beat, kind of civil society, politics, policy. So my recent piece for them looked at the Big Island of Hawaii and where we are going on renewables. And I've actually had a presence here on the Big Island now for over 30 years. I was here as a young military kid when I was 20. And I trained at PTA, which is a big training base in the middle of the island at about 6,000 feet. I was stationed on Oahu at Schofield Barracks. I then left for 20 years, but I came back almost 10 years ago to live permanently here in Hawaii. And in that time period, the Big Island has shifted dramatically away from fossil fuels for electricity. We still heavily depend on fossil fuels for transportation. But the good news here is that recent forecasts from HECO, our utility, show that by around 2030, just 6 years from now, we're going to be almost fully on renewable electricity here on the Big Island, and that's a mix of geothermal, wind power, small hydro, but it'll be mostly solar by 2030. We already have about 20% of our mix coming from rooftop solar here in Hawaii or on the Big Island. And we have now 15% of our overall grid being supplied by utility scale solar. But these actually are what I would call, community scale projects. They're 40 megawatts each. One that was built last year called the Waikoloa Solar Project. The second one coming online in a few months, hopefully, called the Kuawehi Solar Project in the same area, both around Waikoloa on lava land. And combined, you're at 35% of the island's grid needs for electricity with the solar, the rooftop solar, and the larger solar. By 2028, HECO projects will have about 60% of our power met from solar. And with the existing geothermal and wind and hydro, you get to very close to 100% electricity from renewables on this island of 200,000 people with a fair amount of battery storage to back up the renewables. It makes it, firm, or at least partially firm. That is remarkable, that we have gone that far in 30 years, because 30 years ago, we were at about 100% bunker fuel for electricity. PGV, our one geothermal plant, came online in 1992. It's been controversial. I'm not particularly a fan of that plant because it's in lava zone 1, which, as you know, but your listeners may not know, is the most risky area of the island because of lava. It's a real thing. 6 years ago, PGV was this close to being taken out by the lava, which actually took my house in Leilani. I lost my house in 2018 to lava. It's a real thing here in Hawaii. I bought that house knowing it was lava zone 1, but not thinking, it could come. But I was like, it's been many, many years. What are the chances? Lo and behold, a year after I bought the house, it was taken by the lava. PGV, which is a few miles from my house, missed being taken by the lava by literally like a few hundred feet. So the fact that it is there and supplies currently about 20% of the island's needs, in general, it is renewable, it's baseload power, but given where it is, I would not want to see it expanded more than it already is because of that risk from the lava. So modular facilities, solar, wind around the island with battery storage makes a whole lot more sense in a place like the Big Island where, there are volcanoes. So that's a really good news story that, we are here on the Big Island of Hawaii as a microcosm of the macrocosm. But we're seeing Hawaii as a whole heading that direction too. Oahu is our main population center, about 1.3 million people on Oahu. It's actually much smaller as an island than the Big Island. So that will be the real, tricky part of Hawaii, getting off fossil fuels for electricity. But I'm optimistic we can still do that even for Oahu due to offshore wind, due to wave power, these other technologies that can work pretty well in that milieu. I'll talk briefly about the U.S. So the U.S. as a whole is certainly behind Hawaii or California or Washington, but it is transitioning rapidly also toward renewables. Places like Texas, which is not known as being, a hotbed of environmentalism, are actually and have been developing wind power for decades. And Texas is by far the most wind power in the country. We are seeing a transition now in Texas towards solar. So we're actually seeing Texas catching up to California, which is by far the biggest leader in solar in the nation. But next few years, Texas may well actually lap California. Why? Market forces. Texas does not have policies to support renewables. It's market forces. And I know because I work for some clients in Texas. And so this is what I'm talking about, is that the transition is being, promoted primarily now by market forces. Public policy helps, but it's not the main driver.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Tam Hunt about climate optimism and green energy law. So I actually had the opportunity to interview Hawaii's chief energy officer a few months ago, and really reported the same thing. The impression is Hawaii is leading the country, the U.S., in terms of energy policies, moving to renewables. So that was a very good interview.
Can I add a point on that real quick?
No,
So
please go ahead.
yeah, so an interesting historical note, because I have been around for a while. I wrote a piece 10 years ago to the month in a now defunct outlet called Green Tech Media, which was pretty influential at the time. looking at how the Big Island could in fact transition to a fully renewable future. And the HECO modeling at the time suggested about 92% was possible by 2030. And in that piece, I wrote, well, given this modeling, given HECO's apparent support, let's go ahead and make that a law. Let's put it into law. Make it binding. And the debate about mandates and binding targets is, we can talk about that later. But in this case, it seemed to make sense given Hawaii's extreme vulnerability to international price pressures, potential cutoffs, et cetera, given HECO's modeling at that time. Let's go ahead and make it a binding target. And lo and behold, Hawaii, a year later, did in fact pass a law, the first in the country that set a binding target for quite a ways out, for 2045. So it passed a law in 2016. And it was the first in the nation to call for 100% renewables by 2045. I've actually taught this issue in my class at Manoa's law school a couple of years ago. How did this happen? And I had a bunch of speakers come in who were involved with it, and no one had any particular this is exactly how it happened. Everyone's like, well, we put it up there and we pushed for it, we tried to coordinate, and lo and behold, it got through. Hawaii is not always the most environmentally friendly, and lately it's been pretty tricky. I won't go into the details of Hawaiian politics right now, but that did pass in 2016, first in the nation. Shortly thereafter, California passed the same target, 100% renewables by 2045. So in this case, Hawaii did lead the nation. Typically, California leads the nation in that manner. And the saying in California, which is biased, of course, that, as goes California, so goes the nation. But in this case, as went Hawaii, so went the nation. We are still in most states around the country far from achieving the 100% renewables, but we are on a pretty good pathway to get there by 2035 to 2040, actually earlier than those targets.
Do we see similar policies like Hawaii's and California's in other states now?
Yeah, to some degree. I'll give you one more example. Hawaii has passed what's called a microgrid tariff, and microgrids are really key technology. It allows a community or a business with multiple campuses to effectively create a smaller grid that can operate in parallel with or separately from the larger utility grid. And in an era of increased wildfires and risk from wildfires or any other, major risk to the grid, having that ability to what they call island away from the big grid can be really valuable for resilience, for safety, can include some cost savings if you do it right. So Hawaii did in fact pass a microgrid tariff. It's not finished. They passed kind of the phase one, and we haven't seen any built yet in Hawaii. But Hawaii certainly has been leading on that issue, and California, unfortunately, has not. I've been involved deeply in California policy on this issue. And it's been very disappointing in California, where there seems to be a very strong, resistance at the utility level, at the PUC level, to actually creating policies that will really in any way promote microgrids. So yeah, a couple examples for you.
As far as international, I know you're not an international lawyer, but are you aware of policies in other countries, again, like the Hawaii's or the Californias, that are actually mandating move to renewables by a certain date?
Yeah, there's tons of them. I mean, a lot of nations now have a similar target. They call them RPS laws, where you need to get to 100% renewables by a set date. And I don't know the figures right now, but I'd estimate probably, a third to a half of the countries around the world have that kind of target right now, with varying degrees of bindingness to them. And of course, most countries, there aren't any kind of penalties if you don't comply, don't make the target, but the mere setting of them and then actually creating policies to support that transition, or equally so, creating the conditions for market forces to achieve those mandates. can be quite effective.
So we're talking about renewable energy, and there's obviously different types of renewable. Seems you're a big fan of solar, obviously, but can you compare solar, wind, the other major renewables?
Mhm. Yeah, so solar is very attractive for a few reasons. It's low profile, so you don't really see it unless you're pretty close to it, or if you're like in wide open desert, you might see it far away, but it's still low profile. So it's not like wind turbines where there's a lot of, visibility from that technology. It's also very low impact. The impact you have really is just, taking habitat out of circulation. There's no pollution. There's no noise. There might be a low hum at the inverters, close to the facilities at the site, but the panels themselves make no noise at all. So there's a lot to like. On top of that, you have this very reliable trend in reducing the cost. And so we've seen, like I said, a reliable reduction in cost of panels over the years, where they're now about 90% cheaper than they were, 8, 10 years ago, and that continues to decline. Here in Hawaii, you can actually buy panels now, even at retail, at like 40 cents a watt, which is just unheard of. It used to be, 15 years ago, probably $4 a watt. So it's literally down 90%. Looking at wind turbines, they can be quite effective where there is decent wind. There are impacts though, bird, bat impacts, visual impacts, some sound. They shouldn't be near homes, that's for sure. I think the Kahuku wind farm on Oahu, just driving by it and kind of following the debates about that project, it seems like they were built too close to, schools and residences. They probably should have been back further. Offshore wind is definitely very promising, particularly deep water offshore wind and floating wind platforms, because you have very high capacity factor where the wind blows very consistently. You've got far less bird life way out there, far less visibility impact. So if you can build wind turbines on platforms way out in the ocean and have a cable bringing the power back to shore, that could be a very big part of the portfolio moving forward. And we've seen the UK and Europe and Denmark and Germany and China really going big on offshore wind. The US has been, unfortunately, a laggard. We've got a couple of projects now built on the East Coast and a lot of work being done on the West Coast and a lot of interest here in Hawaii, but nothing built yet in Hawaii or the West Coast. Geothermal, I mentioned earlier, can be quite good, but emissions can be an issue. Here in Hawaii, like I said, lava vulnerability can be an issue. I'll mention also small hydro. Historically, hydro has been big facilities that dammed up major rivers and destroyed a lot of habitat. Not a big fan. But if you're looking at smaller facilities, particularly what they call run of river, where you divert water to the side through a turbine to create the power and then back into the river, impact is pretty minimal. So here in Hawaii, we have a few of those. There's a couple in the Wailuku River in Hilo that provides some power for the island, but probably not a big power source here in Hawaii in general. I'll last mention ocean power more generally. You got a new generation of wave bobbers and wave power. There's actually a new device just installed on Oahu or offshore from Oahu that uses wave power to create power. It's been challenging in the ocean conditions to create tech that can last. And there's been, various iterations of research into wave power and ocean power. And there's nothing that's been commercialized on a widespread scale to date. So I hope that changes, but it's been a long road. And I think the general lesson is that the costs are high, the durability issues are a real concern, increasing costs higher. So I think for Hawaii, we're looking probably at a portfolio primarily solar, wind, some geothermal, and probably quite a bit of offshore wind down the road.
What do you see across the country in terms of mix? Is there a ratio of solar to wind to hydro?
I'll give, high level estimates. I think for the US mainland as a whole, by let's say 2040, we're going to see half or more of the renewable portfolio being solar combined with battery storage. And then perhaps, 1/3 being wind, both onshore and offshore, and the rest coming from hydro, geothermal, and possibly some ocean power.
Do you think those same numbers apply internationally?
Well, wind is very dependent on the resource, whereas of course solar can be done, anywhere in terms of that particular latitude. So it will depend on the country, and there's also more of a backlash happening against wind. I think countries with more population and higher density of population will see less wind moving forward because there is kind of a backlash, whereas solar, when done correctly, can be done in a very low impact way. So I think we'll probably see in higher density countries a higher percentage of solar.
Okay. Well, this is all renewable energy, talking about electricity production. Let's talk about the transportation industry, the electric vehicle transition. Is that moving at a pace equal to renewable energy, or is it falling behind a little bit?
It's certainly on a slower time frame, and it may still catch up, but a basic problem with looking at transportation versus electricity is that you have an average lifetime of about 15 years for passenger cars and a bit longer for commercial vehicles. So if we're looking at, for example, now in the US, we're about maybe 14% or so, or getting that way for new car sales being electric. That will still take many years for the whole fleet to turn over to become fully electric. So it's easier to project the time frame for new sales achieving certain targets. And so, for example, California is looking to have about half of all new car sales be electric by 2030. And that's kind of a new target for a lot of jurisdictions. And then hopefully up to 100% of new sales being electric by 2035 or so. If that happens, then you're going to be looking at probably 2050 by the time the whole fleet is electric. So definitely delayed in that way, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at probably 100% utility electricity grids between 2035 to 2040 in most jurisdictions. So I'd say this is a very rough, estimate. We're looking at the EV transition as being maybe 10 years behind the electricity transition. I am now equally optimistic about the EV transition. I call it the revolution, or big E, big V, because we have had some major milestones. And I think, to give credit where credit is due, I think Tesla was really, the big event in this transition, where when the Model 3 came out, I think it was now 8 years ago, 7 years ago, that really marked the era of viable, attractive electric vehicles. And the Model Y, the little slightly bigger successor to the Model 3, what they call a crossover SUV, has been now for a couple of years the world's best-selling vehicle. That is remarkable, truly remarkable, that an electric vehicle has become the world's best-selling vehicle. And it's easy to critique Tesla and Elon Musk nowadays because he's done a lot of stupid stuff, frankly. But you got to give credit where credit is due. He and his company really did transition the global car market toward electric vehicles. And we're seeing some bumps in the road. We have seen a slowdown in the last year in the pace of sales, but the actual sales numbers are still going up. It's just a slower growth rate than expected. And we're seeing a lot of the big US manufacturers kind of saying, oh, I'm not sure we can really make this full transition. But there's also a lot of political forces behind that. I think anticipating, a Trump victory, et cetera. But again, you look at market forces, and we're now seeing pretty reliably around the world a big increase in electric vehicle sales, with, again, some exceptions here and there. Germany, for example, saw a big decline in the last year since December because they actually stopped their local subsidy. I don't know the exact amount, but apparently it was big enough to really make the market go down quite a bit. So EU sales figures for EVs went down in the last year, primarily because Germany went down so much. But around the world, we're seeing still a nice uptick in sales. And so I anticipate we'll get more and more good information as we get more and more EV options and lower priced options over time.
Ground transportation includes both passenger and freight. What about the freight sector? I mean, how is EV moving in that direction?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more options come out. And to mention Tesla again, I mean, their semi has been on the road in kind of small numbers for a few years now, and they're just about to offer the semi for a widespread sale. So it's kind of been at the pilot scale level for a couple of years. That's about to transition, and other companies are also saying this is a major new market. The caveat there, of course, is that if you're looking at long haul transportation, even the semi, you're not going to get the same kind of range with these new generations of electric, trucks that you can with a big diesel. But there are ways to mitigate that in terms of charging more frequently, different ways to allow for that to work on a widespread basis. I don't have any particular forecasts. I haven't worked personally on what they call MDHD, medium duty and heavy duty electrification, and any kind of great detail like I have on the light duty vehicle side. I think, though, generally, given battery cost decline dynamics, we're going to see a similar evolution in that market, but maybe it's delayed a bit, compared to the light duty vehicle market.
You've mentioned you're not a big fan of hydrogen energy, but is there a role for green hydrogen in the long haul transportation industry?
I would say possibly, but unlikely. There certainly is a lot of interest still in doing that. And the merit there is that you can have a much longer range truck with H2 compared to battery electric, at least comparing the technologies today. But again, the problem is what I mentioned earlier. If you're using the electricity to create the hydrogen, then you're literally going to get 1/3 the range in that hydrogen vehicle compared to a battery electric truck. That makes no sense if you're trying to make money in the industry. So I think market forces there will actually weigh heavily against H2 in that space. There might be some pilot vehicles here and there, might be some companies that still trying to make it work, and there certainly are today, but I think they'll fall away as the economics become more apparent.
What about renewable options for mass transit? I know the EU, China, most places have such good long range, high speed rail, and we don't seem to have that in the US. What are we doing there?
Yeah, so there's a couple kind of primary technology options there. So you have in a lot of European countries, like you mentioned, you have actually electric light rail. And as the grid itself greens, then that rail system is equally green, right? It's getting grid power, so it's commensurate. We're seeing some of that in the US, but not as much. We're also seeing more and more electric bus options come out. And those can work with, again, the caveat I mentioned in the trucking and freight industry, in that certainly range can be an issue for electric buses. But if you have access to fast charging, and charging is getting faster and faster, partly because the wattage is getting higher and higher, you have now 350-watt charging options for cars and trucks and buses, and that can give you quite a bit of charge very quickly. I think we're going to see the evolution where batteries get cheaper and cheaper, and those electric bus options and trains get cheaper and cheaper accordingly. And we'll see the market trend more toward those solutions over time.
Do you think policy is needed for that trend, or do you think market will drive that?
As before, I'd say a bit of both. I mean, it's going to be primarily a market dynamic, but if you can put in place policies in the form of both carrots and sticks, I think it can certainly accelerate things. Again, here in Hawaii, we have the new, elevated train option. And in fact, I met with them years ago to discuss solar canopies over that system to provide solar power for their trains. At the time, it was just too soon to have that conversation. But I'm hoping they, as they build out their system, look seriously to, that option, because it makes a lot of sense to put solar canopies over railways around the country and around the world. There's a ton of space both above the train and in the shoulders alongside the trains that can be used to fully power those systems.
What about air travel? Has there been any progress moving planes to renewable energy?
So another example here in Hawaii that's pretty exciting is a technology called a sea glider. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's an interesting hybrid where it's part hydrofoil, part boat, and part airplane. And it basically is a boat at low speeds, and then at higher speeds, it becomes a hydrofoil where the foil actually lifts the boat out of the water, but the foil is in the water still. It's much more efficient than being a boat. And then at higher speeds still, it actually has a wing and it flies out of the water like a pelican, where it uses interesting wave to sky forces that actually give it a bit more lift, being about 30 feet off the water. And this is being tested now in a smaller scale than the full size model, but it's a pretty serious initiative. Got a lot of major partners, including airlines here. Mokulele is going to be piloting them when they're ready, and so I'm optimistic we'll have actually working sea gliders here in Hawaii in the next few years for actual travel between the islands. That probably is not going to work for going from Honolulu to LA, right? So you need different tech for that, unless you like flying that height for maybe 10 hours or so, or maybe longer. There is, I think, a possible role for H2 in long haul aviation. This is because batteries now and for the foreseeable future are very likely too heavy to allow for a battery electric plane to actually work to replace current jet fuel planes. So it looks like there may be some room there for H2 to actually be a substitute fuel for long haul travel. That's one of the possible use cases I see for green hydrogen. Possibly also long-term storage, seasonal storage, in some locations that have more seasonal variations. So I'd say the long haul aviation part is maybe the biggest X factor for Hawaii, the US, and the world as to what can be used to replace it. Fortunately, I believe global emissions, I think it's maybe 3% of global emissions comes from long haul travel or aviation. So it's not going to be a showstopper, but I'm also optimistic we'll have most short haul aviation be replaced with battery alternatives like the Sea Glider or other options too.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. You can go to tam-hunt.com. You can also find me on medium.com where I blog. And also I have some books on Amazon, the one I mentioned earlier called Solar, Why Our Energy Future is So Bright.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.